So today on the podcast, I have on Kimberley Watson Smith. Now, for those of my listeners who've been with me from the beginning here, you'll remember that I had her on the podcast just about a year ago to debunk the movie Who Killed Joseph Smith. Well, the same folks that are perpetuating that falsehood are now piling on making the claim that Joseph never introduced or practiced plural marriage. So Kimberly and I have a conversation debunking that idea. Now, Kimberly doesn't just debunk the idea that Joseph never taught or practiced plural marriage through historical accounts, but she then dives deep into the scriptures to prove that celestial plural marriage is a true principle. Now, I want you to have a pen and paper handy throughout this podcast because we take a deep dive and you'll want to write down a whole bunch of scriptures to go back and read later. Prepare to have your minds blown on this episode of the Mormon Renegade Podcast. So I want to take just a few moments here and just say thank you for listening. I can never tell you how much it means to me that you spend your time here with me. Now, on top of that, last year I received donations that helped me upgrade the audio, equipment, and software. This year I want to do the same thing for video. Now, if you want to help out and make a donation, you can do that by going to MormonRenegade.com and making a donation there. Also, check out the Mormon Renegade supply store at MormonRenegade.com and pick up some merch. Now, if you can't do any of those, I completely understand. It's not like it's been a banner year necessarily for our finances. So maybe just keep the podcast in your prayers. Finally, as I've started to do more video, there's a YouTube channel up for the podcast. But just between you and me, I ain't going to be there very long because I have a feeling I'm going to get kicked off. So to stay one step ahead of that, I've made a channel on Rumble. So head on over to Rumble, look up the Mormon Renegade podcast channel there, and crush that like and subscribe button. Thank you.
You're listening to the Mormon Renegade Podcast.
Well, Kimberly, thanks for coming back on.
Thanks for having me, Dave. I'm excited to be here.
I'm excited to have you here. I got to tell you, our conversation we had last time was one definitely, in the top 2 or 3 of my favorites we did. I always love how you just come prepared and you got your facts straight, and it's absolutely awesome. So
thank you very much.
The reason, as we talked before on the phone, one of the things I'm noticing is that now, last time we talked, it was about, debunking the movie Who Killed Joseph Smith and just showing the falsehoods and just the kind of absurdity of the whole thing. But now they're really making a push on Joseph and Brigham, and they're making the assertion that plural marriage was Brigham Young's idea, right?
Right, yes.
And that Joseph never taught plural marriage. He never lived plural marriage. In your estimation, what's the danger of that?
Oh, that's a very good question. So I think we definitely have to consider the implications of that. And when you get to the heart of the Joseph fought polygamy movement, where they try to claim that it was Brigham Young who was the author of Mormon polygamy and not Joseph, the heart of that movement is that they don't believe in priesthood. And that's the very heart of it, right? But it's disguised under this umbrella of we're just seeking truth and we only want truth. And the historical record is plain that Joseph Smith fought polygamy until the day he died. And then Brigham took over the church for power and polygamy. And any authority that the church had at the time died with Joseph Smith. So ultimately, it is an attack on authority and priesthood.
Right. So why are they fighting so hard against priesthood, right? Because that was something that Joseph revealed a ton about, right? It's pretty hard. from a restorationalist kind of standpoint, it's pretty hard to separate this idea of priesthood and the restored gospel. What is it about priesthood that they're not liking?
Right. So that's a really important question, because it's not so much, well, it is priesthood. It's like when I've had conversations with people and I start asking the hard questions and I flesh out what they're really trying to tell me, it always comes down to that this is about proving that the church doesn't have priesthood, that the church doesn't have authority, that Brigham Young usurped the authority. Because ultimately who they are promoting is that somebody else, some other group, some other person has authority.
Okay.
And so it's ultimately about that. So if you take out Brigham Young, right, you don't just take out it's more of priesthood line of succession, or priesthood passing on of a mantle to Brigham Young. Because if you take away that mantle and you take away Brigham Young, you don't just take away authority, priesthood, but then you can take away any of the ordinances, such as temple ordinances, and any other teaching or doctrine that they don't like, that Brigham Young ultimately unsealed to us that he had received through Joseph Smith.
I got you. It's amazing that Brigham seems to be the linchpin in this whole thing, right? Now,
Right.
Certainly Joseph is, the head of the restoration. But boy, Brigham seems to be the linchpin that everybody wants to go after. And I don't know if that's because they don't like what Brigham taught, they don't like Brigham's demeanor. I just don't understand what the animus is towards that man. I mean, he leads a people into the high mountain desert and carves out a civilization that would become one of the predominant cities, certainly in the Western United States. And I would say it probably rivals, as far as culture and industry, any other city within the United States. And so you think that a guy who was able to do that would be lauded, but that's not the case.
Oh, yeah, definitely not. It's, again, I think it comes down to, okay, so we have a parallel going on here, right? So after the death of Joseph Smith, you have everybody who's coveting Brigham Young's priesthood position. Okay. Even before the transfiguration of Brigham Young, he is the president of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles, right? That responsibility to then lead the church, even if you can say he's not replacing Joseph Smith, that responsibility to lead the church fell on his shoulders by virtue of the fact that he's president of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles. And the rest of the first presidency of Joseph Smith, right, they fell into apostasy. William Law, Joseph Smith actually cut Sidney Rigdon off from the church in 1843. People don't, I know that history has been clouded. But he had written a letter to basically to the entire church and asked them to spread it abroad, that he wasn't going to sustain or support Sidney Rigdon anymore. So it came down to a bunch of men in Nauvoo who coveted Brigham Young's priesthood position, and in order to basically try to take that priesthood away from him, or the idea that he's the rightful successor, they have to then attack him. And they attack him on the one doctrine that hadn't been introduced to the church as a whole yet, that they can easily use to manipulate people with, and that was the doctrine of plural marriage.
Gotcha. So who are the players involved? Is it Justin Griffin still? I mean, who are the players involved here that are really pushing this idea that Joseph Smith didn't practice, nor did he teach plural marriage?
Like in my video I made, Joseph fought polygamy, the resurrection of an old RLDS narrative. Ultimately, the source is, right, it's a resurrection of the old RLDS narrative. So, but those pushing it today are the prominent leaders in this movement. I'll say are, number one, Denver Snuffer, and then the Doctrine of Christ, leaders in the Doctrine of Christ movement, which they've kind of mingled together now.
Right.
that would be Justin Griffin. And there's also other leaders. Well, I won't say leaders. They're the most vocal. Whitney Horning, she presents herself as a member of the LDS Church, but she's converted to Snufferism. And you know who Denver Snuffer is, I'm assuming.
Oh yeah, yeah. No,
oh, okay.
I know who Denver Snuffer is.
So right, so she's presented, and I guess when she wrote her book, Revealing Joseph, I don't know if you've heard of that book.
I haven't.
Okay, so Whitney Horning in 2019, as a member of the LDS Church, wrote a book called Revealing Joseph, where she takes basically the same arguments from the LDS Church and then writes it in a book and then presents it to right members of the church and starts converting them to this narrative. But while she's claiming to be a member of the church, she'd actually already spiritually left the church and was converted to Denver Snuffer. So she's been influential in the Joseph Fought Polygamy movement, where she is actually converting mainstream LDS to that idea. And so there's her, and then there's also Michelle Stone, who is still a practicing member of the church, who has her podcast, and I won't give the name, so because I'm not going to give her advertisement, but she is mingled with like Justin Griffin and Whitney Horning. Like these are the people that she interviews on her podcast. She spoke at Justin Griffin's premiere on January 19th. So helping to promote his movie, Who Killed Joseph Smith. Part 3 of Who Killed Joseph Smith will be on Brigham Young taking over the church for power and polygamy and trying to prove that polygamy started with Brigham Young, not Joseph Smith. So
what kind of
it's not going away.
Right. What kind of facts are they using to back this argument up?
Right. Well, actually,
I guess facts is a loose term, right? What do they purport as evidence? How's that?
Oh, that's a good question. So you have to understand the history, which I'm assuming you do, of plural marriage in Nauvoo and what was going on. So I'll just go over a few things. So it's interesting whenever I see the debate on social media over the Joseph Fought polygamy, it's the same recycled quotes over and over again that they keep pounding the same key, and they play on people's ignorance. So the 3 quotes that they use are where Joseph Smith said, "What a thing it is to be accused of committing adultery and having 7 wives when I can find only one." And I want to talk about that because that is only a small part of a larger sermon.
Okay.
So when you extrapolate one sentence from an entire sermon, you can twist it to make people believe whatever you want, right?
Right.
So that's one of the arguments, is that quote. Then they take from the Joseph Smith papers, they take original source documents, and they try to show that they were changed. But again, we need to talk about that too, because when you actually get down to the heart of it, they weren't changed the way they think that they were changed. Okay. So those are the main 2 arguments. And then of course they use quotes that either have been debunked or aren't reliable. They're secondhand quotes, or they're quotes from unsourced quotes. For example, they take a quote supposedly that came from Phoebe Woodruff that basically says that she preaches in public that polygamy is a true doctrine, but she actually hates it, and she only does it so she's not thrown out of the street.
Wow.
And then, but when you get to the source of that quote, it was actually printed in the Anti-Polygamy Standard, and it was from an anonymous source. So it's not even a reliable quote. And then you have Phoebe Woodruff. Excuse me?
No, I was just saying, no, it's not. It's pretty. It sounds like it's pretty shoddy history.
Right. But then when you actually read Phoebe Woodruff's autobiography, she's bearing a powerful witness of the truthfulness of plural marriage and how she received her testimony, and that it came from Joseph Smith. So it just plays on people's either ignorance of history and their emotions, and then and they themselves aren't even fact checking their own quotes that they use.
Okay. All right. So let's talk about the context, because that one you quoted of Joseph Smith, where he says, what a thing it is for a man to be accused of having 7 wives when I can find only one. Let's talk about the greater context there. What was, you said that they took out that one little line and really narrowed in on it. What was the larger context of what it was he was speaking about there then?
Okay, I'm just going to pull up some notes here. So we kind of have to understand what was going on in Nauvoo at the time, right? So you have Joseph Smith. He's first trying to introduce plural marriage in Nauvoo. And the Lord basically forbids him from making it public.
Right.
Right. And so so if you look at section 132, when the Lord is actually revealing the doctrine to Joseph Smith, what does he say? Joseph Smith says he received the revelation because he was inquiring on the Lord to understand what justified his servants Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob of having more than one wife. And so how does the Lord respond to Joseph Smith? He says, prepare your mind, right?
Right.
So number one, it requires a person to prepare their mind to receive an understanding or knowledge of this doctrine. And so as the Lord is then now commanding Joseph Smith, okay, he's received this revelation in 1831, actually. And then the Lord finally says, okay, it's time to introduce it, right? It's time to start living it as a people. So in Nauvoo, he's not revealing it to the church as a whole. He's revealing it to those whose minds have been prepared to receive it.
Okay.
Right. So it's on an individual, confidential basis, one-on-one, with men who have not only proven themselves faithful, but who were spiritually ready to receive this additional light and knowledge. Right.
Okay. Yep.
Okay. So I just want to get the whole background because
No, I think this is great.
Okay. So because it tells a completely different story when you have like the whole background. So as Joseph Smith is introducing this doctrine again through private interviews and confidential means, he's then of course you start to get the rumors out there of other men who have gotten wind of this doctrine, and then they start teaching it. Right? They're either teaching it themselves according to their own understanding, or you have like John C. Bennett, right, who takes the doctrine and he twists it, and he uses it to his advantage by saying Joseph has sanctioned this practice, and then he's using it to seduce women for his own purposes.
Classy.
Right? So we have John C. Bennett's spiritual wifeism, which is completely, it's not, I wouldn't even say it's a counterfeit. It's a practice of his own make, right? He's going to women, he's saying this is what Joseph Smith's doing, and then he's not even marrying these women, he's just seducing them, right? And saying it's okay because we're spiritually married. So, and that's just a complete abomination to what the doctrine of celestial plural marriage was.
Sure.
So you have him, right? And so then Joseph Smith is going around and he's like saying, if any elder is taught preaching or practicing plural marriage, he will be cut off of the church. So why is he saying that? Because there was no elder that had the authority to preach or practice plural marriage without Joseph Smith's authority.
Right.
Right. In Doctrine and Covenants section 132, it says on this law. What is that law? That only the one who held the authority could teach it and then could reveal it, and then it was by he could approve or disapprove any plural marriage.
Right.
So So then you have, so then you have these elders thinking, oh, there's this new doctrine that says by virtue of the priesthood, I can have as many wives as I please. So then Joseph Smith is like having to correct that. No, that's not, the priesthood itself does not entitle you to have more than one wife.
Right.
He's saying it's based on a certain law by my authority, and you don't have a right to teach this. So he's going through Nauvoo trying to then correct what John C. Bennett's teaching and then what these other elders are teaching.
Well, let me stop you right. Yeah, that makes sense. Let me stop you right there, because as you were saying that, I think we have historic precedents for when members of the church kind of took a doctrine and just ran with it, right? If you remember when Joseph institutes baptisms for the dead, they go down to the river and they just start going at it, right? And Joseph's like, slow your roll. We need to make sure that we're documenting this and that we have these things in order. So it's not an isolated incident that members of the church hear about a principle and just go for it. And then Joseph's got to come back and be like, take a breath. Let's do this right.
Right. And that's an important point to bring up, because even with the baptisms for the dead, they were like, women were being baptized for men. And they're like, no, there's an order for this. Like you said, we've got to make sure they're recorded, and we have to make sure that women are being baptized for women and has to be members of your family and things like that. So yeah, he has to, right. I think the saints got, like, bless their hearts. They were like, oh, okay, we're going to just start obeying without understanding that there's bounds that the Lord has set. And, there's a law they have to follow. And so that's so that's another attack, right, that they make against Joseph Smith, is there's no way he would do something in what they say is secret, when it really wasn't secret, right? It was private. It was, well, we're not going to announce this to the world, right? Because these are sacred doctrines that we don't cast our pearls before swine. Right. Even Jesus Christ didn't do that. He took his apostles up to the Mount of Transfiguration, and he taught them higher laws, and he said, don't make these known until after I've resurrected. Right. And so Joseph Smith, the same thing. We're not going to announce this to the world, right? We're not going to announce this to the public or even the church as a whole, whose minds have not been prepared to receive these things.
No.
So not secret, right?
Right.
It's who's prepared to receive, right?
Yep. I think I think the other thing here too is that there's a reason the Lord told him to keep that kind of on the DL for a little while. Joseph was almost killed several times just for saying, look, there's another book of scripture here, right? That was bad enough. But when you now go in and start upsetting Victorian sensibilities, I mean, that would have set the whole place on fire, and ultimately did, right? I mean, even the saints moving outside the United States did not stop the oppression from happening once everybody found out about it.
Right.
It was a well-founded fear.
Right. And even when you read the stories of the men and the women who Joseph Smith is teaching this to, you have like women who are like, well, this is repugnant to my sensibilities. And then Joseph is saying, will you go and receive a testimony? Right. And so you have women who are they're taught the principle by Joseph Smith, and then they actually have to receive their own witness.
Yep.
And they go and none of them agree. Like, we have this idea that these women were just coerced or they were duped. But when you actually get to the heart of it, and these women, they go and they know Joseph Smith's a true prophet. They know he's not going to teach any doctrine that is contrary to the order of heaven. And then they go with that faith and they pray, and they don't just receive an answer by the power of the Holy Ghost. Many of them receive angelic visitation. They receive visions. They have the heavens opened. They're shown far into eternity. They come back and they say, I know this is from God. And then they enter into the practice with full knowledge and full use of their agency. So anyway, getting back to leading up to that quote, right?
Yeah.
So that's why it was so important to Joseph Smith that not any elder is out just publicizing this doctrine to the world, is trying to teach it for themselves according to their own understanding, right? It's like this has to be done in the correct way, and ultimately by Joseph Smith, who was the one who held the key, right? That knew who was prepared, but then also who the Lord had commanded to practice it, because not everybody was commanded to practice it.
Right.
And even Joseph Smith, when he was commanded to take plural wives, the Lord gave him the names of the women. It wasn't just women. He was like, oh, she's pretty, right?
Right.
It's the Lord said, these are the specific women that need to enter into this order with you. So then we have, I think the first plural marriage in Nauvoo was in 1841. And then, and that was personally with Joseph Smith and Louisa Beeman. But then, at the same time, he's then sealing other men to more than one wife. And then finally, Hiram Smith, for a time, it's important to understand that Hiram Smith, for a time, he did fight against the principle until he learned for himself that it was true. And then he became like the biggest advocate for plural marriage. And he got really excited to teach the doctrine, and so he introduces it to the Nauvoo High Council in 1843. And after he introduces it to the Nauvoo High Council, there were two men specifically that not only rejected it, but got very angry and bitter over it: William Law and William Marks. Are you familiar with this history?
I'm familiar with William Law, but not Marks.
Yeah. So William Marks, he was what was he? Was he the Nauvoo High Council president? He became conflicted, and William Law especially. William Law and his wife became extremely conflicted, and so William Law is like, he goes to Joe. So he was introduced by Hiram. He asked Hiram if he could have a copy of the Revelation, and him and his wife would read it and ponder it. They took it and they read it and pondered it. This is according to William Law's diary. So, and then they don't accept it. They completely reject it. It was like their minds had become darkened, I'm sure, through other sins, but their minds have become darkened, and they're not only like, this isn't a true doctrine. He now seeks to fight against it. He goes to Joseph Smith and he's like, so William Law is like begging Joseph Smith not to introduce it.
Right.
And he says, and then he tells them, if you do not introduce this, we will become the largest Christian church the world has ever seen. And Joseph is like, well, that's not the purpose, right? It's not about becoming the most popular, right? And he's like, I have to introduce this or we will be damned as a people. And then ever since then, William Law became Joseph Smith's biggest enemy. And he went behind his back and he riled up a group of 200 saints in Nauvoo, and they entered into an oath to take Joseph Smith's life. So, and Joseph Smith became aware of this oath because two brave young men, Denison L. Harris and Robert Scott, they were part of those secret meetings. They go back and tell Joseph Smith what was going on, so he's aware. So we have to understand that Joseph Smith knew that there were these leading men in Nauvoo, and I can give you the names. Let me give you the names. So it wasn't just William Law. It's important to know all of the names. So the leaders of this plot to kill Joseph Smith were Chauncey L. Higby, Artie Foster, Joseph H. Jackson, William Law, Wilson Law, and Austin Cowles. Now, William Marks, like I said, he became bitter over, but from my research, I can't see that he was part of this plot.
Okay.
Although he never accepted the doctrine, and he didn't ever accept the ordained leadership of Brigham Young. But those were the leaders of this plot to kill Joseph Smith, and it was like I said, in the spring of 1844. And Joseph Smith became aware of this. So he knows. And so William Law, and so again, he'd gone to Joseph, begged him not to teach. And of course, like I said, Joseph Smith's like, I have to, or I'll be damned with my people. And so William Law decides to expose it to the public opinion, right? So what does he do? He basically, well, first of all, before that, so I'm getting ahead of myself. I have to back up because this part's important. So before that, he then charges Joseph Smith with adultery. He takes him to Carthage court and charges him with adultery because in the state of Illinois, obviously having more than one legal wife was against the law, and it would looked upon as criminal.
Right.
So in order for William Law to try to stop this law, right, stop the teaching of plural marriage, he takes Joseph Smith to court.
Wow.
And so obviously Joseph Smith denies the charge in court. I think he's acquitted, or it doesn't even go to trial or anything. And obviously that's going to anger William Law. And so then Joseph Smith, he comes back to Nauvoo, right? He's the mayor of Nauvoo. He has to answer for this charge. He gets, there's a public address called the Address to the Dissenters of Nauvoo, where he basically openly refutes the charge of adultery. So remember, he's being charged with adultery. That's
right.
what William Law is trying to charge him with, is adultery. So then you go, so he, so this declaration, he gives this declaration or this sermon called Address of the Prophet, Testimony Against the Dissenters of Nauvoo. He gives this public address on March 26, 1844, and he basically says, I can prove William Law's a perjurer and that he's transformed a truth into a lie. And then he goes on and he gives this sermon and he says, and I'm going to quote it if that's okay.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, because he says, so he starts out and he says, I have not been married scarcely 5 minutes and made one proclamation of the gospel before it was reported that I had 7 wives. So if you think of that statement, well, that's true, right? He didn't have 7 wives 5 minutes after being married to Emma, right? Yep. And then he says, I mean to live and proclaim the truth as long as I can. So what is he saying? He knows that William Law has entered into an oath. So he's then going to deny the charge because he wants to live as long as he can to proclaim the truth.
Right.
And then he says, this new holy prophet, William Law, has gone to Carthage and swore that I had told him that I was guilty of adultery. This spiritual wifeism. So what is he denying? Adultery and spiritual wifeism. Right? And he's telling us this is what he's denying. He's being charged with adultery and spiritual wifeism, which he's not practicing.
Okay.
Right?
Right. He doesn't say anything about celestial plural marriage. He's just talking about spiritual wifeism and adultery.
Right.
Okay.
Right. Because William Law is trying to get him to stop teaching plural marriage. So he's going out there and he's transforming a truth into a lie, saying Joseph Smith is guilty of adultery, that he's practicing the same spiritual wife doctrine as John C. Bennett, which everyone at that time knew how bad that was, how evil it was, right?
Right.
John C. Bennett was seducing women. He was aborting. He was a doctor, so he was aborting any children that were produced from those.
Oh, geez.
You know, fornication, right? So of course Joseph Smith is like, I'm not guilty of this. I'm not guilty of adultery. I'm not guilty of spiritual wifeism. And he goes on and says, why a man dares not speak or wink for fear of being accused of this. A man has asked me whether the commandment was given that a man may have 7 wives. And now the new prophet has charged me with adultery. So again, celestial marriage that's not what celestial marriage was, that a commandment that a man can have 7 wives. That wasn't what the doctrine was.
Nope.
Just a man can go out and get 7 wives. So again, he's very specific in his wording. And it goes on, I never had any fuss with these men until the Female Relief Society brought out the paper against adulterers and adulteresses, which we can talk about that in a minute. Dr. Goforth was invited into the law's clique, and Dr. Foster and the clique were dissatisfied with that document. So right there, he's making reference to the leaders of the plot, right?
Wow.
He specifically mentions them, Dr. Foster and Law's clique. William Law's going to know what clique he's talking about. He's talking about those 200 men who had entered into an oath to take his life. And then he goes on to say, and they rush away and leave the church and conspire to take away my life. And because I will not countenance such wickedness, they proclaim that I have been a true prophet, but now I am a fallen prophet. What a thing it is for a man to be accused of committing adultery and having 7 wives, again, referring back to the doctrine of having 7 wives. Right. He says, when I can find only one, close quote.
Mm.
And so not only that is that he only had one legal wife, right? According to the state of Illinois, Joseph Smith only had one legal wife. So what is he speaking to? I can only find one wife. Well, what is the only one wife he can find? His one legal wife.
Emma. Right.
Because so his plural wives were given to him by God, by God's authority, and he was not answering to man for wives given to him under another authority that didn't belong to man, if that makes sense.
No, that makes perfect sense.
So,
go ahead.
Well, so what I was just going to follow up with and say is that that's the main quote they use to proclaim that Joseph Smith was fighting against plural marriage. When he wasn't fighting against plural marriage, he was fighting against the charges of adultery with that quote.
Gotcha. So let me ask you this, Kimberly, and maybe you could shed some light on this, because this is something I always wondered about William Law, because he seems to be the guy who is really both the brains behind the outfit and kind of the guy who gets everybody else riled up, kind of the guy who starts it all. Why doesn't he just either leave the church or proclaim that Joseph's a fallen prophet and start his own? Why do you suppose he went to such lengths to make sure that Joseph Smith didn't make it out of there?
That's a good question. So if you actually look at the history, if we could tell a little bit more history on William Law, which I think is important because it sheds a light on an important principle, that if William Law was actually committing adultery.
Oh.
And so what happens when you start committing adultery? Your mind becomes darkened. So not only has his mind become darkened, but then he's under the power of who?
Satan,
right?
Yep.
Right. So before this law was introduced, he was actually, and that was one of the reasons he was actually excommunicated, was because he was committing adultery. And so it's interesting because he'd actually written in his journal, which tells you kind of his state of mind. He says, quote, if an angel from heaven was to reveal to me that a man should have more than one wife, and if it were in my power, I would kill him. He says that in his journal. So what is he saying? He would kill an angel of God. Right. He had murder in his heart. He was not a good man. He was not just angry about plural marriage. He was under the influence and the power of the adversary because he had already broken his covenants. He'd already committed a really heinous sin. And so then Satan took advantage and used him to try to destroy Joseph Smith.
I think that there is a really important lesson for all of us there who adhere to the gospel. And that is, when you start justifying your own sins, it doesn't just stop there, right? There's going to be spillover effect that's going to darken your heart, that's going to allow you to be susceptible to those chains with which the adversary seeks to bind us in. And those chains aren't, it's not a passive thing, right? It's not like your progression is just damned at that point. This is a regression, and it's a regression back into darkness. And I think William Law is probably a great example of that, and should be a cautionary tale for the rest of us, because if we slide down that slope, there is no just stopping. You're either moving forward or backwards, and backwards in this case leads to just darkness and nasty things.
Right. Yeah. And I'm trying to look really quickly. There's a scripture in Doctrine and Covenants that says that if you do commit adultery, that you will deny the faith.
Mm-hmm.
So that's just a principle of the gospel. So, right. So we have to be very, very careful to watch our words, thoughts, and deeds. Commit adultery, or we're lusting after, women or men that aren't our spouses.
Right.
Like what the scripture says, we will be in danger of denying the faith. And so you can kind of see, like, William Law, he's a member of the first presidency, right? So he had a lot of light and knowledge.
Yeah.
And so the greater light, the greater the condemnation, and right, the greater power the adversary has over you. He is literally in the hands of the adversary, who's put murder in his heart. He seeks to destroy Joseph Smith. He seeks to destroy, right, this basically this doctrine. He seeks to destroy the entire church. And
right.
Yeah, so it's pretty serious. It's if you really look into the history of this, instead of right, just believing a reinterpretation of the history, like, William Law is the bad guy here. It's not Brigham Young.
Right. And for a lot of this history, if I'm not mistaken, and you can correct me if I'm wrong here, Brigham's not even on scene. He's in England, right? He's in Europe.
Right. Well, he was actually in the Eastern States.
Eastern States. Excuse me.
At this time, right, campaigning for Joseph Smith. And the other apostles were over in Europe, if I'm not mistaken. But yeah, he wasn't even on the scene here. This was all unfolding while Brigham Young and the other apostles are away. So you can imagine. So not only that, so imagine Joseph Smith. He has to keep the church together. He's being, he has his rogue first, William Law, trying to expose him not only to the church as a whole, but Joseph Smith is the mayor of Nauvoo. He's been exposed to, like, it wasn't just members of the church that lived in Nauvoo. It was the largest thriving city in the entire state of Illinois.
Yeah, so larger than Chicago at that time.
You have to kind of, right. You actually, he had to answer to the people who weren't even members of the faith. Hey, look, I'm not guilty of adultery. I only have one legal wife. Like, he's trying to say that I have all these wives that I don't have, meaning legal wives.
Right.
Right. I'm not breaking the law of the state of Illinois. And then not only that, you have extradition orders still in place in Missouri. If Joseph Smith were convicted of a crime, he could have been dragged back to Missouri just on that basis alone, which we know that the Missourians have been trying to kill him since, for over 10 years. So he was in a situation where he was not only trying to protect himself at the time, but he was trying to protect the saints. And I think that's what we need to understand. This wasn't Joseph Smith making a public declaration against plural marriage and lying. He was denying what he was being accused of, which was adultery and spiritual wifism.
Wow. Yeah. Yeah, and that never comes out, right? And really, like you said, unless you understand the history, you're not going to get that full effect. You're not going to understand
Right.
what Joseph is saying, much less the history on Law and Marx, right? Because if you don't understand that
Right.
and where they're coming from, good luck.
Right. And so the reason why this quote is so important to understand is because in the Joseph fought polygamy movement, what they do is, again, they take that one extrapolated sentence and then they put it on a meme, or they repost it and they say it like, if you believe Joseph Smith practiced polygamy, then you'd have to believe he was a liar, and I choose to believe he's telling the truth. And so they make it about this, almost like they play on people's emotions, and, oh, look, I'm so righteous that I will not believe that he's telling this lie. And then other people just read it, and right, it's kind of like a false dilemma here.
Right.
Oh, if I believe Joseph Smith practiced polygamy, then I have to believe he was lying here when he said this, when they don't even understand context, and they don't understand history, and they don't understand anything that had happened up until that quote or anything after. And so it's a very manipulative tactic to use,
Sure.
and it really does suck in people who are just, quite frankly, are ignorant of the true facts and the true history.
Right. Let me ask you this, because this is something I'm genuinely curious about, and I don't know if maybe, because I know you have had interactions with some of these folks. Do you think this is something that kind of those who are front and center on this movement, do you think they actually believe this, or do you think they have a different axe to grind and this is the outlet?
I believe that the leaders of this movement have an axe to grind, and I do unfortunately feel like that there are a lot of innocent victims
Right.
that are just victims of an agenda and a false information and a false history that they've been fed. But as far as the leaders of the Joseph fought polygamy movement, like Denver Snuffer, Justin Griffin with his movies and part 3 that he's going to come out with, which will all be about Joseph fighting polygamy, and those that write the books like Whitney Horning and Richard Caron that wrote a book, The Exoneration of Joseph and Emma. These are not honest people.
Right.
And they do have an axe to grind, not with just the church, but with Brigham Young, with certain doctrines of the church. They all reject temple ordinances. All of them. They're not just rejecting, right? Like, I know, like, we may disagree with if the LDS church has keys or not, but they're not just rejecting the idea that LDS church doesn't have keys or authority. They're saying temple ordinances are a satanic invention of Brigham Young. We don't believe in temple ordinances. We don't even believe that there was ever priesthood authority in the church. We don't believe, right? They don't believe in Melchizedek priesthood anymore. So it's not just we don't believe in polygamy, and these are implications we have to consider, because they go hand in hand. If you reject polygamy, you're going to reject temple ordinances, because they came to us because of Brigham Young, right?
Right.
It was Brigham Young who, right? Joseph Smith unfortunately died before he could reveal them to the church. So Brigham Young revealed them to the church, and so then they reject temple ordinances. Well, then you reject your sealing, your family sealing, you reject your marriage sealing, you reject all of those things that are part of the restoration.
Right. I think I made this point before when you and I talked about a year ago, which is it's the same tactic that we've seen with the founding fathers of the United States. If you can discredit the member, or not the member, but the founders, you can then discredit everything that the founders did. Right. Now, in this case, they definitely are trying to discredit Brigham Young, but they are now setting up a much different Joseph Smith. right, than what history bears. And it's not a man that I think, for those who are well versed in Joseph Smith, would ever recognize, right? So in some ways, they are going after Joseph Smith, his true character, and they wish to replace him with something that, I don't know, quite frankly, as you're going through the implications of 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 going after Brigham and rewriting Joseph's history, just as you stated, the natural outgrowth is a church that looks nothing like the Restoration. It is, anything that was distinctly Mormon about that is gone. And it's so insidious.
Right.
Let me ask you this question while we're talking about folks like Griffin and whatnot. And in a year of doing this podcast, I've done a couple episodes which have really required me to do a lot of research. And what I found is that if you can figure out how someone is getting the money, you can usually get to the bottom of who is really at the source of this thing. Even a movie like the one Justin Griffin puts out, it's not cheap to make. Where's he getting his funding? Do you know? Have you heard?
So like I couldn't confirm this like with absolute certainty. What people have reached out to me to tell me is that especially his first movie was funded by a couple that are leading, how would you say, leading members of the Denver Snuffer movement.
Okay. All right.
So you kind of like, they were the top contributor of Who Killed Joseph Smith, like financial contributor. And so that's why I say that, so the Doctrine of Christ movement and the Denver Snuffer movement are kind of separate, but they've now mingled together. And of course they have the same agenda, so they support these projects that are helping to advance their narrative, ultimately an attack on Brigham Young, which is attacking priesthood and authority and any doctrine of the Restoration that they don't want to accept that has actually come from Joseph Smith.
Yeah.
Right. Like not just temple ordinances, but we're talking, like priesthood restoration. So many people, I've heard so many people say they don't even believe that Aaronic priesthood was restored through Joseph Smith. True. Like it's crazy. Like not like you'll get so many people like varying degrees of what they've rejected now, like everything from the Aaronic priesthood to doctrine sections in the Doctrine of Covenants. They take the sections that they like, or even just verses they like. This is inspired, but these sections aren't inspired. They've rejected the Book of Abraham, a lot of them. Just there's so much. It's fascinating at the same time to watch. Like they're just unraveling everything. Like you said, they're taking down the foundation, one doctrine at a time. But the polygamy is like the theological weapon. So at the end of the day, it's not about polygamy, because, right, like if you're a mainstream member of the church, like I am, technically you're not expected to live it, right? You're not asked to live it as mainstream.
Right.
So they're not asked to live it. So it's not really about polygamy per se. It's that you can use that as a theological and a historical weapon to then attack the foundation and take away doctrines you don't like, and then build your own foundation, and then using Joseph Smith's name to do it.
And I feel like plural marriage is one of those things that would be very easy to weaponize, because it's tough, right? I mean, it's tough in the sense of wrapping your arms around it, right? And it's really easy to turn that into the weapon, because it does tug at the heart somewhat. And I suppose if someone was already struggling with their testimony of those things, if someone was to come along and go, oh, you can have the Restoration without that, you just have to buy into these other concepts, that's probably a pretty attractive offer.
Right. It's really attractive, because to them, all you need is a broken heart and a contrite spirit. That's all you need, right?
Right.
If you listen to them, I don't know if you're familiar with their doctrine.
I am.
They've taken away even baptism. Well, if I have a broken heart and a contrite spirit, Christ is going to baptize me with his authority. And then there's not even the actual physical ordinance anymore, right? And so how nice is that? Oh, I just have a broken heart, contrite spirit. Well, what does that even look like? And then you can define it any way you want, and
Right.
you've just taken away. Like, you don't even have Joseph Smith anymore, who like is teaching us physical baptism. You're teaching a physical ordinance as the sign, right, that you're entered into a covenant. They're just it's just fascinating to watch. Like, it's heartbreaking, but it's like almost mind-blowing how much people are willing to reject over this one doctrine that they don't have an understanding of.
Right. Well, let me ask you this, Kimberly. How successful have they been as far as getting people out of the church, or I would even call it restored gospel at this point, right? Because look, I'll be honest, my son approached me with this just, I don't know, probably a month ago. And we sat down and had a great big long history lesson. And I thought, well, one way or another, he's going to know that this is wrong. It's either he's going to pick up the history. He's like, I'm never bringing that up again because dad won't shut up. But one way or another, this affects all of our kids, right? If those who believe that the mantle fell to Brigham Young, all of our kids are on the line on this one, and I just feel like it's so important that we get that out. How successful have they been overall?
I would say it is the largest growing movement and the most successful movement to destroy the church.
Whew.
When I say church, I'm saying restoration.
Sure.
Okay?
No, I get you.
Right. So it is I've watched this since 2020. I've been like just observing people that I never thought in my life would fall for this movement are entrenched in it. Like, it is just crazy. I don't even have the words to describe, like, stalwart defenders of Joseph Smith at one time, who had what looked like a testimony, are now fighting against almost every part of their heritage, essentially, because religion is a heritage.
Right.
And if you want to talk about, so from my perspective, maybe if you want to get into this or not, I don't know if you do, but this isn't just a historical debate, because history is just history. There's a doctrine behind plural marriage that is actually very beautiful. And if people just understood the doctrine and realizing that plural marriage is not a black mark on our history. It wasn't a mistake that Brigham Young just misunderstood or he got it wrong. We are talking about men and women who made the ultimate sacrifice by being obedient to a covenant that none of us, I don't believe any of us would have been willing to, at that time, being persecuted their entire lives in order to reestablish not only the house of Israel in the last days, but to reestablish the chosen bloodline through which the priesthood is not only restored, but then propagated on the earth in such a way that it will never be taken off the earth again. And we actually have them to thank, instead of spitting in their face, slapping them over the face, right, tearing down their character, accusing them of all manner of sin and wickedness. And it's just astounding to me that we have at this point where we could actually, right, turn our backs on everything that we've received through them, right? We're eating the fruits of Brigham Young's labor. And when I say Brigham Young, I'm talking about all those that stayed faithful to him, right? So all of those that through persecution, that, plural marriage wasn't easy. They were persecuted, not from the government, but even in Utah, church members persecuted them. Only 20% of the church ever were faithful to celestial marriage.
Yep.
So they're persecuted from within. They're persecuted by the government. They stay true and faithful so that the blessings of the Abrahamic covenant could be passed down to their posterity, so that, Israel could be restored, so that, all of the covenants and all the promises given to Abraham and his seed anciently, so God could fulfill those prophecies. And then we turn around and we say, no, thank you.
Yeah.
This is icky and gross to us because I've been told it was icky and gross, and I haven't even searched the scriptures to find out what's true and what's not. It just, it breaks my heart. Like, it just really breaks my heart.
And that's just it. We, as Mormons of every stripe, almost every stripe, we tend to pay homage a lot to our ancestors. I should say their ancestors. I'm the first Mormon ever of any stripe in my family. However, even I get a sense of what they endured, right? And it amazes me, because I'm with you. You're talking about a people. Let's start without plural marriage, right? Who sign up for this new American religion from a man who doesn't have formal education, which is nuts in those days, right? Normally your preachers are coming out of Harvard and those types of schools. You move several times. Plural marriage is taught. Those who live it are, like you said, were persecuted from within and from without. And today, I don't know what the numbers are, but today in Utah, I'd be curious to see how many men and women are descendants of that practice, right? And their progenitors laid everything out on the line for this, not just plural marriage, but the gospel, laid it all on the line. They sold out. They cashed their chips in and said, you know what? I'm all in. To be able to turn around and then say, yeah, you know what? They didn't have it right. Whew, that's a bold claim.
Right. Yeah, that is a bold claim. And you say you're like the first generation Mormon, but one thing we don't understand about plural marriage, it's the everlasting covenant.
Yep.
Okay. And I really would like to talk about the doctrine of it. If
please, I would love to.
So I don't know if you want to get into that right now.
Yeah, let's do it.
But it's essentially the everlasting covenant. And so when you or anyone is then adopted into the covenant through baptism, so you're adopted into the covenant through baptism, right? So so the founders of our faith, Joseph Smith, Brigham Young, John Taylor, they have reestablished the everlasting covenant. So I want to talk about that and go back to, because we call it the new and everlasting covenant, but it's everlasting, and they brought back it anciently, but it's new to this dispensation.
Right.
Okay, so they've reestablished the everlasting covenant. We're going to talk about what that is. And then you and I, or anybody that's then through baptism and through sealing in the temple, are not only adopted into that covenant, but they are sealed to that bloodline for eternity.
Yep.
From generation to generation.
Yep.
So without that foundation, none of us could receive any of the blessings of the Abrahamic covenant. So what happens if we're going to cut ourselves off? We fight against it. Yeah. We cut ourselves off. Okay. So if you want to talk about, is it okay to discuss a little bit of the doctrine of it?
Please do. Look, Kimberly, I'm going to level with you here, and I'm going to level with you on two things that I haven't talked about before on the podcast. I've kind of done my best to stay away from plural marriage because everyone says, well, you're a fundamentalist, Dave. Of course you have a dog in that fight, right? So it carries less weight from me. So when someone like yourself, who's active LDS, has a testimony of this, I think it carries more weight. The other thing I'll say, and this is breaking news now, as of last weekend, I am practicing the principle again, right? So now I have a double dog in the fight, and so yeah, I definitely want to tackle this, and I feel like that this is the perfect place to do it because you always have your facts straight, and you're a rock star, and it's just time. And if we're going to debunk what the other side is saying, we have to get into the doctrine. We have to show why it's so important, and we have to illuminate it and bring it in some ways. Plural marriage, I've always said, is kind of like the crazy uncle that shows up for Thanksgiving. Nobody likes talking to him, right? Because you just know at some point it's going to get uncomfortable. But this is a beautiful doctrine. This isn't a doctrine that we should be ashamed of. We should own this. We should 100% own this. So right. Yeah, let's break it down.
So just leading up to that, if I could just quickly share my story.
Yeah.
Of how I came to have a testimony of it.
Yeah.
Because I think it's important. Because so like you say, like you're fundamentalist, I'm mainstream LDS, right? And so
right.
Why do I need a testimony of it? Why do I have a testimony of it? Well, I can remember back in 2016. So, well, first of all, it's important to understand. So I was born in the church, but I was raised in a very inactive home. Okay, so the gospel wasn't something that was just handed to me. I wasn't taught it in my home. I was baptized at 8, and then it was like church was whenever I could get there kind of thing, because my parents didn't take me to church. Okay, so I just want to understand that this isn't just because I've been accused of, oh, you're just false traditions handed down by your every accusation's been thrown at me to try to discredit like my testimony of not just our marriage, but of the church in general, or any part of the gospel. So I just want to make it clear. So this wasn't just a faith that was handed to me that I didn't have to work for. It was actually something I had to work at. I had to search out what is the faith, what is my faith, and so it took a lot of years of searching. I knew that plural marriage was part of our history. A lot of people want to say in the mainstream LDS, I was never taught this. I didn't know that Joseph Smith had more than one wife. And so then they have this faith crisis when they find out he did. That wasn't the case for me. I knew Joseph Smith, like I read Work and Glory when I was in high school, trying to learn about my faith. And so I could gain my own testimony. But it wasn't really until 2016 when I was watching a documentary from the Joseph Smith Foundation called Joseph Smith More Than You Know. And the documentary has nothing to do with plural marriage at all. It's a documentary about Joseph Smith. But in that documentary, they were sharing quotes that came from Brigham Young, and I received an undeniable witness that Brigham Young was the living witness of Joseph Smith. And that if I wanted my own living witness of Joseph Smith, I also needed to have not just a testimony, but of knowledge of all of the revelations that he revealed, including section 132 of the Doctrine and Covenants. So I have been studying this doctrine since 2016. And through that study, I have gained an unbreakable, firm, steadfast testimony, section 132 of the Doctrine and Covenants, of the historical practice of plural marriage, and why it was essential for the salvation of the world, essentially.
Ooh, I can't wait to hear this.
Share a little bit of what I've learned on my journey.
Yeah.
And I do want to say that I empathize with women in the church because I was there too. Right? I'm like,
Right.
this, it's one thing to say, it's one thing to say, yeah, it's fine that Joseph Smith and Brigham Young lived it, but it's another thing to actually live it, right? And so I can empathize with women who it, like, quite frankly, scares the living daylights out of them. And that's why so many people are drawn to this new movement, because like you said, they can have Mormonism without plural marriage. And so instead of grappling with what that doctrine is, it's just easier. And so I
Right.
really understand that. And my heart goes out to those women, and I just want them to know that it's okay, and it's actually something that is very beautiful, and that we can be proud of our religion. We can be proud of the founders of our faith, and we can look up to the women of the Restoration as our nursing mothers, and we can be thankful for what they did for us. If
That's
that makes
awesome.
sense.
Yep.
Okay,
Yep.
so kind of what leading into just talking about, why was plural marriage restored in Nauvoo? Right? Why is that such an important doctrine? Like it's pretty much the capstone of the Restoration.
Right.
So and we'll just go back. I'll try to do it justice, case, because it's hard. It's hard to teach this. But so the everlasting covenant. Plural marriage is, like I said, in the scriptures in 132, it's called the new and everlasting covenant. But everywhere else throughout scripture, it's called the everlasting covenant. So why is it called in 132 the new and everlasting covenant? Because like I said, it's new again for this dispensation.
Right.
But we have to understand that it's the everlasting covenant. So what I did and how I started to understand or learn about plural marriage is I went through an entire word search in all of the books of scriptures on everlasting covenant. And so that actually takes us back to Adam.
Okay.
But for the sake of brevity, we're going to start we'll start with Abraham.
Okay.
That's okay.
No, that's great.
Okay, so in Genesis 17, 1 through 7, and I won't read all 1 through 7, but at the end of verse 7, the Lord says to Abraham, I will establish my covenant between me and thee, and thy seed after thee in their generations for an everlasting covenant, to be a God unto thee and to thy seed after thee.
Okay.
Okay. So this is where we say that, Abraham is the father of the covenant.
Yep.
So that's why let's just start with him. So here, this is where he's established that everlasting covenant. So everlasting is from generation
Forever.
to generation.
Yeah.
Forever, unbreakable. So we got to so what is this everlasting covenant he's just established with Abraham? Not with just Abraham, but it says with thee and thy seed after thee, right?
Right.
So it's with him and his seed. What is seed? It's
Children.
posterity.
Yep.
It's children, right? Okay. So the terms of the covenant it's pretty simple. Abraham would have endless posterity, right? We know.
Yep.
It's part of the Abrahamic covenant, and that the priesthood would be held only by the seed of Abraham.
Okay. Yep.
So
that was all part of that covenant.
Right. So we're talking that. So if you want the priesthood, you have to be
From Abraham. You have to be one of Abraham's children. Yep.
You have to. So that's the everlasting covenant. Okay. So it's a single covenant that God establishes with Abraham, and then he reestablishes it anew with every righteous patriarch.
Right.
Right. Every righteous patriarch after Abraham. And every righteous patriarch after Abraham is also
the seed of Abraham.
Seed,
yep.
the seed of Abraham. Okay. And so that's important to understand. So that here God is established not just a family. That's why we call it the house of Israel. It's the house of Israel, who is the house of Jacob. And if it's your house, it means it's your family, your kingdom. He's established, here is a kingdom of fathers and sons who will have the everlasting priesthood with their seed forever and ever.
Right.
That makes sense, right?
It makes total
You're
sense.
following me?
Yep, I'm following you.
Okay.
Which is surprising. I am slow, so I appreciate you checking with me.
No, I know you understand. I'm just
No, you're good. Honestly, I'm glad you're asking because as you can tell, I ask a ton of questions, Kimberly. I'm glad you're checking with me.
So every time that you have everlasting, now there's other places in Genesis that has the word everlasting covenant, and every time it's always repeatedly associated with posterity.
Right.
Okay. So how do you then carry on like a covenant? It's passed down. And just like in Doctrine and Covenants 107, it says the priesthood is passed down how? From father to son.
Yep.
Right?
Yep.
I don't know if I need to pull that up, but
it's patriarchal in nature. Yep.
Right, it's patriarchal. So we're not just talking about when a father he's in the church and he puts his hand on his head and he gives the priesthood to his son. We're talking about it's passed down through bloodline,
right,
through your lineage, right? You have so right, then Abraham, he has Isaac, and so it was with Isaac that bloodline, or the chosen, the everlasting covenant, was going to continue through Isaac's bloodline, because we know that Abraham was married to Hagar, and Ishmael received a different inheritance other than the priesthood inheritance.
Right.
Okay, so it had to go from Abraham to Isaac, and then from Isaac to Jacob, right?
Right.
And then with Jacob, through Leah and Rebecca, and then the other two, his other two wives, then that's how we established the house of Israel, the 12 tribes of Israel.
Correct. Yep.
And so, which, if I could just speak to another rebuttal,
that
those in the Joseph fought polygamy movement will give, just so let's just squash that rebuttal right now.
Okay.
Is that they like to say, they like to interpret the history of that to say, well, Jacob didn't really want to marry Leah. He was kind of deceived. So because he really wanted Rachel. And so he didn't choose to enter into plural marriage. So they look at that as, right, that wasn't a correct principle. However, why would Jacob be willing to then work another 7 years to obtain a second wife if it wasn't something that was ordained of God, right? And then you have who comes through. So which patriarchs come through Rachel and which patriarchs come through Leah? Do you know? Because if
Joseph
God renewed,
Joseph comes through Rachel, right? Or am I wrong?
Hold on, let me look at my notes here. Sometimes I have to remember to, because it's
I'm not
for example, Leah, through Leah comes the tribe of Judah.
Okay.
And who comes through the tribe of Judah? Jesus Christ.
Yep.
Right?
Right.
And then you have let's see. So then you have Elijah is said to come from the tribe of Benjamin, which is who is the son of Rachel.
Okay.
So, right here you have Elijah's pretty important, right?
It's hugely important.
And we'll talk about Elijah because this is important to understand Elijah in the last days.
Elijah's
right? So
hugely
then you have
important.
Christ who comes through Leah. So right? So are you going to take away those two wives from Jacob and say God didn't ordain this. And then
No.
you take away Leah, you take away Christ. If you take away Rachel, because he was already married to Leah, then you take away Elijah. And I think Moses comes from Levi, who's the son of Leah. So,
Yeah.
right?
Yep.
Okay. Oh, yeah. And Joseph comes through Rachel because it's right.
Yep.
She's then Joseph because he's from the lineage. He's a Josephite, Joseph in Egypt.
Yep.
Right.
That's correct.
Joseph.
Yep.
Okay. Okay. So we're right. So, right. Okay. So again, so what is passed down then through each of these patriarchs? It's not just they're not just now members of the house of Israel, but they are now that everlasting covenant is renewed through each of those patriarchs. And with the everlasting covenant, the priesthood continues, right?
Yep.
Because it has to be passed down through lineage. We
Yep.
need to understand that without lineage, there is no priesthood.
Right.
Okay?
Right.
So it's passed down through lineage, through the house of Abraham. And that's why you have in the book of Matthew, chapter 1, didn't bring my scriptures. What is the first thing that Jesus Christ reveals? You hurry and pull it up.
Yeah, let me go get there too. Sorry. All I got's my silly phone. Matthew chapter 1, you said?
Yeah, so I think this is so important because why here in the Gospel of Matthew does Jesus Christ give us his lineage? It opens up and says, the book of the generation of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Why was that so important?
Because he's making a claim with the priesthood. He's making a claim about the priesthood through his lineage that this is who I am. This is right. I am by birthright and entitled to these things, and know that I'm acting within that office.
Right, exactly. So he's establishing who he is, what lineage he's from. He doesn't say, well, these icky polygamists are my fathers and they need to repent, right? He doesn't ever say that, right?
No.
He's actually proud that he is of the lineage of David and he's the lineage of Abraham.
Right.
So, so right there, okay? So he's, again, like you said, he's establishing his authority. And then we see that Zacharias, he does the same thing. Yep. Or John the Baptist, because Zacharias he's from Levi. He's the last. So that's another reason why the birth of John the Baptist is so miraculous, is because had Zacharias not had a son, that would have ended the Aaronic priesthood.
Yep.
Through Levi.
Yep.
And so the angel comes and he's like, you're going to have this son, right? And it's miraculous. It's a miraculous birth, like Jesus Christ is miraculous, because God needed to carry on that Levitical priesthood.
Yeah.
And through the bloodline.
Yep.
Not just, you think, well, he could have, Zacharias could have died and he could have sent an angel, but how do you establish the blood? How do you establish it forever so you don't have to have an angel come every time? Through a bloodline, right? Through a son, through a child, through posterity. So it's very important we understand that God is continuing, again, this everlasting covenant through posterity.
Right.
And it wasn't with any woman. She also had to be a pure bloodline.
Right.
And so that's why it's important to know that Mary, the mother of the Son of God, is a virgin. That word virgin isn't just that she's never had sex. Virgin means purity.
Right.
It means that she's a pure bloodline.
Gotcha.
Right. And so it's important that, we call her the Virgin Mary, right? And it's important that she has virgin before her name. Because God wants you to know that Jesus Christ came through a pure lineage. an undefiled lineage, an undefiled bloodline. And so we call her the Virgin Mary because it does mean that she has never been defiled, but so the bloodline never got defiled because she was true. She was a virtuous woman.
Right.
Who never broke the chastity, right? But then that she was also of the pure blood Israel.
It's speaking to her lineage as well as her
As well
marital
as.
status.
So a dual meaning.
Yeah. Yep.
And that's important, right? God he wants us to understand something here. That's why he gives her the title of virgin, and not just so we, right? Not just so that we know that she didn't
break the law of chastity. Yeah.
Break the law of chastity. So, okay. We're up to that point, right?
Right. Yep. We're good.
Okay. So then, so again, I wanted to go over that history to understand what the everlasting covenant was. And he established it with Abraham. And again, it was endless posterity and priesthood.
Yeah.
Okay, so, and God is basically saying this will never be taken from the earth. Now we know that in Jesus Christ's time, we do go into apostasy, right?
Right.
And the Jewish church loses priesthood, but it's not because priesthood is taken from the earth per se. It's that the bloodline was taken from the church.
Oh, I got you. Okay.
And Christ's seed was scattered or hid.
Right.
Have you ever heard that?
I have. Yep.
Okay. Is it okay? I probably need to get my scriptures. So can you just give me like 30 seconds?
That would be perfect because I'm going to get mine. And then I'm also going to shut off my wife's phone, who I found out she just left it in here. So yeah, let's do that.
So we're getting to then present day, right?
Right.
We've established the everlasting covenant with Abraham that continues through Jesus Christ. And then we know that the Jewish church went into apostasy. And I don't know if you're familiar with the history of that Christ's bloodline was hid.
I am. Can I point something out about what we were talking before about bloodlines that I find super interesting? You have Christ who comes out and says his lineage back to his fathers.
Right.
I find it interesting that God the Father seems to do something very similar when he introduces Joseph Smith to the Savior in the Grove. He could have said, "This is your Savior, hear him. This is Jesus Christ, hear him." No, he goes out of his way to say, "This is my beloved Son, hear ye him." So lineage is a very important thing, not just here, but throughout time and all eternity.
Right. And so that's actually, so God is a God to us because he is, right, he is the king in the Melchizedek priesthood. He's a king and a priest.
Right.
Over his posterity in the eternal world, and then which he tries to pass on to us in the mortal world, right?
Right. Yep.
So, because he's trying to establish his kingdom here too, right? He's
correct.
Given us an opportunity to come to mortality, and he's going to try, and so that when we say everlasting, it goes both ways, forward and backwards.
Yep.
And it starts with God the Father, who he himself has kept this everlasting covenant.
Yep.
He's passed on a priesthood through his son, Jesus Christ, who's come to this earth. And in through the posterity here. And so giving us the same promises that were made to the fathers.
Right.
So in going to when Joseph Smith is translating the Bible, it is revealed to him that, so we'll go to There's a revelation that was given to Joseph Smith on December 6th, 1832, and it's recorded in section 86 of the Doctrine and Covenants. And it says it was a revelation that was received while Joseph Smith was reviewing and editing the manuscript of the translation of the Bible.
Okay.
And I think it's one of the most profound and significant revelations that we failed to understand. Many of us have failed to understand, or we don't understand the significance of it. And in verse 9, or excuse me, let's start with verse 8. The Lord reveals to Joseph Smith, he says, therefore, thus saith the Lord unto you, with whom the priesthood hath continued through the lineage of your fathers. For ye are lawful heirs according to the flesh, and have been hid from the world with Christ in God.
Ooh.
So this is a revelation given to Joseph, not just Joseph Smith, but other leading elders of the church, including Brigham Young, Heber C. Kimball, John Taylor, Parley P. Pratt, and others. What did he just tell them?
Yeah, let's just break this down here real quick, because if I'm not mistaken, and you're right, I probably read this 100 times. I mean, as you can see, it's marked up, right? The whole thing's marked up here, the whole section. But I've never caught that. So he's basically saying, you guys are descendants of Christ, right?
Yes.
Ooh, that's awesome. That's absolutely awesome, Kimberly.
That's why it was important that we understood Christ. Like you said, why did God say, this is my beloved son? Right? Because it's establishing father, son, priesthood lineage.
Right.
And here, then, Joseph Smith is told, and you, to Joseph Smith and other leading elders of the church, that priesthood is continued. So we think the priesthood was taken from the earth, but like I said, it was removed from the Jewish church and the bloodline was scattered, or it was hid.
Right.
It was, and then we could talk about, go into a whole story of the Knights Templar and how they hid Christ's bloodline. Anyway.
Yeah.
But,
you and I will need to talk.
This for now.
You and I will need to talk off air for just 5 minutes, because I got something I want to run by you. But yeah, no, absolutely. Is it okay if I use this at church next Sunday? I promise I'll give you the credit as you showed it to me. But yeah, this is awesome.
You don't need to give me the credit.
Oh, come on, Kimberly.
Truth comes from God, so it's.
I know, but still, you pointed it out to me.
Okay.
All right.
Okay. Do you want me to continue because it gets better?
Yes. Yes, I do.
Okay, it gets better. Okay, so the Lord reveals to Joseph Smith that he says, for ye are lawful heirs, so that's plural. So again, not just talking about Joseph, but talking about Brigham Young, Heber C. Kimball, like these leading elders of the church. They, according to the flesh. So again, they have the bloodline of Jesus Christ. They've been hid from the world with Christ. And it says, therefore, verse 10, your life and the priesthood have remained and must needs remain through you and your lineage until the restoration of all things spoken by the mouth of the holy prophets since the world began. So that priesthood has to remain through who? The lineage of Joseph Smith, Brigham Young, Heber C. Kimball, John Taylor, Parley P. Pratt, Orson Hyde, until the restoration of all things.
Right.
Have we had a restoration of all things yet?
I would say no. I think there's still more out there that we know we need more scriptures. We know those are out there. Who knows what kind of covenants those scriptures have. So no, I would say no, we're not done yet with the restoration.
According to Bruce R. McConkie, who was a great theologian, gospel scholar, he said that the restitution of all things doesn't happen until the end of the millennium.
Right.
So the priesthood that God has, the priesthood given to Abraham in the everlasting covenant has to remain through who? The lineage of Joseph Smith, Brigham Young,
John Taylor. Yep.
Until the restoration. It has to remain. So, okay. So that's important to understand, that we have to understand that. And then in verse 11, it says, therefore, blessed are ye if you continue in my goodness, which what would be his goodness? Continue in his covenant.
Yeah.
Right? Goodness can be covenant, a lot of things. A light unto the Gentiles, and through this priesthood, a savior unto my people Israel. The Lord hath said it, amen.
Wow.
They are to be
saviors.
This is how you gather Israel.
Yep.
Right? This is how you become a savior to the house of Israel. How are you going to gather them back in? It's a bloodline through posterity. How do you have posterity?
You have kids.
You have kids.
You have kids. You get married. Right? You have children. Yeah.
Right. So, in section 132 of the Doctrine and Covenants, it says 132 verse 63. It says, wives are given unto a husband to multiply and replenish the earth according to my commandment, and for their exaltation in the eternal worlds, that they may bear the souls of men. For herein is the work of my Father continued, that he may be glorified. So again, this isn't about, people want to say that it is just about that Brigham Young was this, they want to paint him as this man who was just out for having sex with a bunch of women. He's saying, no, wives are given unto husbands so that they can bear the souls of men, and not just any man, right? What kind of souls is God trying to bring into this world?
We're talking about the lineage of Jesus, right? That very lineage.
Right. And Bruce R. McConkie also taught that, let me get the quote because it's just better to quote. I think he might have been quoting Joseph Smith, so let me just see if I can find it. He says, Israel is an eternal people. She came into being as a chosen and separate congregation before the foundations of the earth were laid. She was a distinct and peculiar people in pre-existence, even as she is in this sphere. Her numbers were known before their mortal birth, and the very land surface of the earth was divided to the nations for their inheritance, according to the number of the children of Israel. In other words, Israel was established before the foundation of the earth. So God needs certain men and women who are already of that lineage before the earth to continue to bear seeds of the chosen lineage on this earth.
Right.
Does that make sense?
It makes total sense.
It's just not any man and woman who are chosen. It's specific men and women who are chosen to carry on the covenant, the priesthood through lineage or through their posterity, so that God can then send pure Israel to pure Israel, mother and father on earth.
Right. Wow. That's powerful stuff.
It's very powerful. And you know that, so we can't have eternal life, right?
Right.
Without passing through mortality, and that without being proven through temporal life. And so it's obvious that the covenant of marriage, it opens the gate to birth, to continue the work of God on earth. And so a righteous man with righteous wives are opening the birth to multiple of those spirits of the house of Israel that are waiting to come to the earth.
Yep.
Does that make sense?
No, it makes perfect sense. It makes perfect sense. And I think when it's put in this context, the beauty of the doctrine of plural marriage comes forward, right? And you begin to understand that this, I'm trying to say this here, not everybody's is is going to live plural marriage either here or the hereafter. I just don't think it's going to happen. Nonetheless, it is an important principle, and maybe there's a reason why it's not instituted amongst all, right? We certainly know in the early LDS church it wasn't. And maybe that was part of that vetting process that happened. So I shouldn't say vetting process, but maybe that's the reason why Joseph had to sign off on every one of them, right? So because he could look with spiritual eyes and say, you know what, I think that's an Israelite right there.
Right. Well, I have some quotes I want to share with you on that.
Sure.
Okay. Because it's actually very fascinating. Again, because when we get to the heart of this gets you for me, it was, I can't believe that this is my faith. This is my heritage. And I am so thankful. So, first of all, Mosiah Hancock, he said, speaking of lineage, he said, quote, "I wish to write now of the prophet Joseph Smith. The Lord revealed to this prophet as early as the year 1831 that in consequence of great wickedness which would come upon the earth in the latter days, it would be necessary for great men to take the noblest wives. The Lord had reserved the most noble of his choice spirits to come forth through a pure lineage, as the noble spirits were not willing to come through a lineage that was corrupt." Close quote.
Wow.
So we're talking about the men and women of the Restoration we're going to bring forth the noblest of spirits.
Right.
And if you think about, well, are we some of those noble spirits? Like if you are a descendant of plural marriage, right?
Yeah.
This is your heritage. This is who God is saying who you are, right? You are these noble house of Israel that you have been preserved to come through a time, right, when the pure lineages of Israel were going to be restored in the last days.
Yeah.
And so can you imagine how hard Satan is working to get you to not know your heritage, to not know your lineage, and to then cut yourself off from those men and women?
Right.
Because he's going to transform the truth to a lie and make you think that polygamy is icky and it is gross, and that Brigham Young didn't know what he was doing, and he wasn't aligned with Joseph Smith. All the things I've heard. Why would Satan want to attack plural marriage? Because again, it's about attacking the priesthood.
Right.
Because if he can stop these lineages from coming forth, he stops the priesthood. And the priesthood is what Book of Revelation says. How was Satan cast out? It was through priesthood.
Priesthood, yep.
How is he going to be cast out in the millennium? Through priesthood. So he has to stop the priesthood lineage from continuing on the earth. So he's going to attack plural marriage. Okay, so we need to go into this. But then I do want to bear there's a couple things I want to share with you. But going into priesthood lineage and some of these men and women and who they are, I want to talk about that. But since we're on the topic of why Satan is working hard to get us to fight against plural marriage, I just want to read you some scriptures, okay?
Okay.
So again, all of this came to me, as I said, as I started just studying word links to everlasting covenant. So I looked up all of the scriptures on everlasting covenant, because that's what marriage is, right?
Right. Yep.
The everlasting covenant, because it's the promise of priesthood and posterity.
Right.
And the only way you have posterity is through marriage.
Yep.
Right. Okay. So I'm just going to read scriptures. I'm just going to briefly read some scriptures in like the Doctrine and Covenants on the everlasting covenant, and then you can see what happens when we turn against that.
Okay.
So so in Isaiah 24:5, we'll just start there first, and we'll go into Doctrine and Covenants. He says, "The earth also is defiled under the inhabitants thereof, because they have transgressed the laws, changed the ordinances, and broken the everlasting covenant." So what was Israel's downfall?
They
broke that covenant.
they broke that covenant. Yeah, they broke. Yeah, man, that's nuts. And to think it
Yeah,
was
that's
their
why they were scattered. Essentially, why they're scattered, right? The God has to scatter them because they've broken the covenant. You know, God always keeps a remnant, but
right.
They broke the covenant. Okay, so and then in Doctrine and so let's go through Doctrine and Covenants, okay? Because there's so many places that it talks about the everlasting covenant that's not in section 132. So in section 1, that's the Lord's preface to the Doctrine and Covenants, and he's saying the entire purpose for the restoration, right?
Right.
And the entire purpose for the coming forth of the Book of Mormon and for the true church to be established is in verse 22. He says that mine everlasting covenant might be established. Right? So to bring back the everlasting, so he needs to reestablish it in this dispensation.
Right.
So that's the entire reason that he's bringing forth the Book of Mormon. This entire reason he's bringing forth the restoration. He's restoring priesthood. He's restoring all of these revelations is so that the everlasting covenant might be established. And then he says in section 22, verse 1, behold, I say unto you that all the old covenants have I caused to be done away in this thing, and this is the new and everlasting covenant, even that which was from the beginning. So here the Lord is telling us that this quote unquote new and everlasting covenant is actually what was from the beginning. So again, not new to this dispensation, meaning it's not a new law, it's new to this dispensation, but it was had from the beginning. Okay.
Right.
And then again in 45, verse 9, he says, and even so I have set mine everlasting covenant into the world to be a light to the world and to be the standard for my people and for the Gentiles to seek it and to be a messenger before my face to prepare the way before me. So this covenant is to be the standard. Remember, it's the priesthood.
Right.
It's to be the standard. Again, priesthood coming through lineage. Again, and then in section 49, verse 9, where the Lord says, wherefore I say unto you that I've set unto you mine everlasting covenant, even that which was from the beginning. So again, testifying that this covenant is from the beginning.
Yeah, and the Lord's going out of his way to show that. I mean, he several times he's saying, look, this is new to you, but understand this isn't new in time.
Right. Okay. And then he says in section 66, verse 2, verily I say unto you, blessed are you for receiving mine everlasting covenant, even the fullness of my gospel, sent forth unto the children of men, that they might have life and be made partakers of the glories which are to be revealed in the last days, as it was written by the prophets and apostles in the days of old. Whew. So when we think about glories, what are we thinking about?
We're thinking about
glories is associated
with
exaltation.
Right. Yeah, the 3 degrees of glory. Yeah.
Right?
Yep.
And so he's saying, this is how you are going to be partakers of that glory.
Wow.
Right? Even if you're not living it, you're receiving it because your lineage is continuing through those who enter into the everlasting covenant. You become heirs through that lineage, right?
Yep.
You become the sons of the fathers of the covenant.
Right.
The sons and daughters. Then in verse 76, okay, this is where the Lord breaks down. He said, these are the degrees of glory. And then he's speaking of the celestial kingdom, right? The lowest kingdom. He said, but into the celestial kingdom. In 76, verse 101, he says, but receive not the gospel, neither the testimony of Jesus, neither the prophets, neither the everlasting covenant.
Wow.
So, Dave, then what is the implication of fighting against plural marriage?
You won't be able to get to the celestial kingdom.
You essentially inherit the telestial, the lowest
Yep.
kingdom.
Yeah.
It says you receive not the prophets, right? Who are the prophets that entered into this covenant? Abraham, Isaac, Jacob.
Yep.
And then in our dispensation, Joseph Smith, Brigham Young,
Yep.
all of those who carried on the covenant, that received it from Joseph Smith and then lived it despite being persecuted against, right?
Right.
Right? And so this is the serious implications here. So essentially you cut yourself off from root and branch, right?
Yeah.
You cut yourself off from being an inheritor of the Abrahamic covenant, not only for yourself, but then for your posterity.
Right.
So that's pretty serious.
That's very serious.
Consequences.
I'm a guy, and I can speak to this with a little bit of experience, I guess is the word I'm looking for. On my side of the family, for reasons I won't get into here, my dad had to change his last name. And it's been hard to do genealogy on my dad's side. And there is something to be said to know where you came from, to know who your people are. And when you don't have that, that can leave you kind of unanchored, right? And I think what's beautiful here is that the Lord is showing that how important it is that we are anchored to our ancestors as Abraham's seed, as Abraham's children.
Right. Yeah, it's very, very important. And what anchors us to that then, right? It's the sealing power of Elijah.
Right.
And so what's interesting to me too is in this Doctrine of Christ movement, right? They reject everything, any covenant that's not what they say is baptism of fire and Holy Ghost, or anything that they say isn't found in the Book of Mormon, what they think isn't found in the Book of Mormon. And what's interesting to me, though, is that when the Lord reveals the Book of Mormon to Joseph Smith in September of 1823, Moroni, he receives a visit from Moroni, if you remember.
Yep.
Remember this part. So he receives it, and what did Moroni tell him specifically? He said, you're going to receive the plate for the Book of Mormon. And then he said that that after he's translated the Book of Mormon, he says that Elijah will reveal his priesthood to you, right? So
yep.
The two things, the mission of Joseph Smith was to bring forth the Book of Mormon and then to receive a fullness of the priesthood through Elijah.
Right.
Right. So who is Elijah? Why is he important to this everlasting covenant?
Well, because he's the one that really, you got to go back to the hearts of the fathers, hearts of the children being turned back to the hearts of the fathers, right? And it's this idea
right.
of reconciliation to where it is we've come from, and this reconciliation of parent to child and all the way back to Adam.
Right, exactly. And so Elijah was required to return the new and everlasting covenant of marriage. Why? Well, Joseph Smith taught, he said, Elijah was the last prophet that held the keys of the priesthood, and who will, before the last dispensation, restore the authority and deliver the keys of the priesthood in order that all ordinances may be attended to in righteousness. It is true that the Savior had authority and power to bestow this blessing, but the sons of Levi in his day were too prejudiced. So why send Elijah? Because he holds the keys and authority to administer in all of the ordinances of the priesthood, and without the authority is given, the ordinances could not be administered in righteousness. So in other words, Elijah was the last prophet to hold the sealing power associated with the fullness of the Melchizedek priesthood. And therefore, it's his role to return to the earth to fulfill the words of Malachi, right?
Right.
How do you turn the hearts of the children to the fathers? It's through the sealing power.
Yep.
The sealing power of the priesthood.
Absolutely.
And so without the sealing power, marriages and families are not sealed for eternity.
Okay. Yep.
Right?
Yep.
Without the sealing power. So if you reject section 132, you reject like eternal marriage even from a monogamous couple, essentially.
Yeah, from a monogamous
because Elijah,
standpoint,
he's coming and he right. So Joseph Smith essentially linked the power of Elijah through the fullness of the Melchizedek priesthood. So we know that Elijah lived in Israel at the time when they did not have access to the Melchizedek priesthood. And right, because Israel rebelled, right? Again,
right. Yep.
Their bloodlines were scattered. And so Elijah alone then held the priest because he has to continue the priesthood, right?
Right.
Then Joseph Smith taught that, so what's the power of Melchizedek? 'Twas not the priesthood of Aaron, which administered in outward ordinances and offering sacrifices. Those holding the fullness of the Melchizedek priesthood are kings and priests of the Most High God, holding the keys and the power and blessings. So Joseph Smith and Brigham Young, Joseph Smith receives the keys and priesthood of Elijah. He gives those to Brigham Young. They hold the fullness of the priesthood, and they are kings and priests unto God.
Right.
Right. So establishing the fullness of this priesthood. So, and then revealing the covenants of the fathers to the children.
Right.
Which covenants of the fathers are our patriarchal fathers who have the everlasting covenants of priesthood and endless posterity.
Absolutely.
Which we cannot obtain except for through them, that's what exaltation is.
Yep. Wow. And even to a guy like me who has not shied away necessarily academically for a number of years on plural marriage, this puts it into a whole new light, right? That the whole how it's connected with priesthood at such a fundamental level is it puts things into proper perspective. Wow. Then all of a sudden what we thought was an obscure old school doctrine is now a pretty big matter of importance spiritually.
It's very important. And then if I can just read one more scripture, and then I do have something from church history to share that I think is actually very, very significant. So in section 131, then again, because we said that this was tied to priesthood, and this is how the priesthood is going to continue through the end of the millennium, right? What we talked about. So in Doctrine and Covenants 131, verses 1 through 4, the Lord says, in the celestial glory, there are 3 heavens or degrees, and in order to obtain the highest, a man must enter into this order of the priesthood, meaning the new and everlasting covenant of marriage. And if he does not, he cannot obtain it. He may enter into the other, but that is the end of his kingdom. He cannot have an increase. So according to this section, the Lord is tying marriage to an order of the priesthood, right?
Right. Yep.
And then he says you can, and why is it the end of your kingdom? If you do not enter into this covenant, it's the end of your kingdom. Because in order to, what is having posterity? It's about multiplying the priesthood.
Right.
Having a God's kingdom is a kingdom of priests, kings and priests.
Right.
So if you're going to have a kingdom of kings and priests, they have to have the fullness of the priesthood. Then they have to have seed to pass that priesthood on to. So if you're not willing to enter into this priesthood order, which is the new and everlasting covenant of marriage, then you have an end.
Right.
Because God doesn't want you to have seed just for the sake of having seed. He wants you to have seed within that covenant to carry on the covenant, which is the priesthood.
Yeah, and I think it's
And
fast.
you
I'm
obtain it is
sorry.
by entering it.
No, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Oh, go on.
There's a little bit of a delay. I apologize. Um, I think
Oh, I'm done.
I think I think this is really starting to get into that realm too of what was called the mysteries of godliness, right? Because these have
Mm-hmm.
such eternal consequences to them, right? Sometimes I think certainly as Mormons of every stripe, I think we have this idea of, well, we get sealed so we can have kids forever because gosh, we just love our kids. And certainly that's a part of it. But I think what we're seeing here is God laying out the plan of how that how the gods continue, I guess. I don't know. I'm trying not to sound too sacrilegious and just throw around terms, but
Right. So when you really dig into like I said, what are the reasons that we have priesthood being restored in Nauvoo was, first of all, that Joseph Smith didn't receive, the priesthood of Elijah until 1836,
right,
right? And so technically he's trying to prepare the people. He hadn't even revealed to anybody until Nauvoo that he had the priesthood of Elijah. He talked about receiving these keys like almost futuristic, because they didn't really know, outside of Oliver Cowdery, they didn't really know he'd received this priesthood or these keys. But he's between 1836 and 1841, he's slowly trying to prepare their minds and trying to teach them. The Lord doesn't just vomit truth on people. He teaches them line upon line, precept upon precept.
right,
And so you have it. So it's really important to understand that why did he wait until Nauvoo? And it's because, first of all, he didn't receive it until 1836, but then he also has to prepare the people for these things. And just trying to pull up this quote here, because it's actually fascinating. And like we said before, it's Joseph Smith alone held the keys in Nauvoo, where he could turn the key of revelation and know who were essentially of the right lineage or the right birthright, who
right,
were chosen by God to reestablish or to restore this everlasting covenant. And so I just found it interesting that there's not many of the there aren't many of the sealings of Joseph Smith, like the actual words have
right,
been revealed. I don't know if you know that, but I started going and trying to study some of the words of the actual sealing of Joseph
right,
Smith to some of his wives. And I think the sealing between Sarah Ann Whitney and Joseph Smith is actually very significant. And if you don't mind, if I could read that.
absolutely. Please do. Look,
Okay.
this show's all
So,
about you at this point, Kimberly. I'm just here for the ride. You're awesome.
okay.
So whatever you want to do is great with me.
Okay. 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 So Sarah Ann Whitney, she is daughter of Bishop Noel K. Whitney and Elizabeth Ann Whitney. And so I'm going to read the words of the sealing covenant between Sarah Ann Whitney and the prophet Joseph Smith. And then I want to then read you the patriarchal blessing of Noel K. Whitney and his wife. And it's fascinating. So in the sealing covenant between Sarah Ann Whitney and Joseph Smith, the Lord said, if you both agree to covenant and to do this, meaning enter into the everlasting covenant of marriage, eternal marriage, then I give you, Sarah Ann Whitney, my daughter, to Joseph Smith to be his wife, to observe all the rights between you both that belong to that condition. I do it in my own name and in the name of my wife, your mother. So, in other words, the Lord revealed this to Noel K. Whitney, who then performed the ceremony.
Right.
This is what the Lord revealed to him, okay? So this is who's speaking. So he says, I do it in my own name, in the name of my wife, your mother, and in the name of my holy progenitors by the right of birth, which is of priesthood, vested in me by revelation and commandment and promise of the living God, obtained by the holy Melchizedek, and other of the holy fathers, commanding in the name of the Lord all those powers to consecrate in you and your posterity forever.
Wow.
So, in other words, he is saying that the union between Sarah and Whitney and the prophet Joseph Smith is all of the powers of the priesthood of Melchizedek is going to be concentrated in you, in them, in Sarah and and Joseph Smith and your posterity forever. So again, right, establishing the everlasting covenant through Joseph Smith and Sarah and Whitney, who will then go on through the endless ages of eternity, bringing forth the seed of Melchizedek.
Wow.
And I say that because listen to this. So remember, she's the daughter of Newell K. Whitney.
Right.
In the patriarchal blessing of Newell K. Whitney, it says, inasmuch, so this is to Newell K. Whitney, whose daughter is Sarah and Whitney.
Right.
Says, inasmuch as thou knowest thy progenitors and art assured concerning the lineage through which thou hast descended. Now he's identifying lineage. I bless thee with a father's blessing for thee and thy children after thee, for their inheritances to the end. And as thou art a descendant of Melchizedek, one of thy posterity shall be like unto him before the Lord.
Wow.
What did he say? He says that Newell K. Whitney is a literal descendant of Melchizedek, and then he says, one shall be like unto him, one of his posterity is going. So Newell K. Whitney is going to raise up a heir who will be like unto Melchizedek. Melchizedek was greater than Abraham.
Yeah. He established.
Who else can raise up someone as great as Melchizedek, if not Sarah and Whitney and Joseph Smith?
Right. Now, let me ask you this, because now I'm just curious. Not that it matters, because we have all eternity. Did they ever have kids together?
I don't believe so.
Okay,
However,
so this is
again, when people want to say, well, it has to be fulfilled right now.
right.
We're talking, what did that revelation say? It said that the priesthood will continue through your lineage through until the restoration of all things. Joseph Smith is going to be alive in the millennium.
Right. Yeah.
So
wow.
Who else, right? So what happens at the resurrection? You resurrect your righteous husband will resurrect who?
His family, all the way
His
back
family.
to his father. Yep.
Right. So his wives. So this, I believe this is a future. There's still yet a future fulfillment of this promise.
Yeah.
Right.
No,
because again, we're talking eternal marriage isn't just, sometimes we put our blinders on and we think this has to be fulfilled within this short 80 years of my existence on this earth. And if it's not, then the Lord was lying. When we're like, no, we're talking about eternity.
right.
Like, this is eternal marriage. So the future fulfillment of this prophecy will come to pass.
Whether it happens now or in the millennium, it doesn't matter. At some point, it's going to come to pass.
Right. What God says, he fulfills all of his promises. So
it's, when I look at Mormon history, I am continually fascinated by that early period in the church where it seems like we were just way more bold about being like, yeah, you're a descendant of Melchizedek, right? Or whatnot. And it's always fascinating to me to see how these men in church history, then you can start to see them strive to take on those characteristics. These are things that they feel in their core, and it affects their it affects how they go forward from this point on.
Right. Well, that's why I think it's important that we've kind of lost our identity, right? We, as members of the church, you see so many, like, we're losing youth, we're losing like members of the churches of all ages. And
Yep.
I think it's because we've lost our identity. We don't really know who we are. Like, for example, like, what does it mean to be a member of the house of Israel? Well, when we
Right.
get our patriarchal blessing, it's revealed to us, our lineage. And it's fascinating to me that the times that I've taught gospel doctrine, I'll ask, what does it mean to be the house of Israel? And are you Israel? And I get blank stares, or people don't understand what that means. And so if you
Right.
don't understand what it means and the lineage that you're a part of, what are you living up to?
Right.
Does that make sense? Like,
No, absolutely. It makes sense.
Once you understand who you are and what you're a part of, like, your attitude changes, your whole purpose changes, and you want to
Right.
live up to a higher standard, and it actually makes you become a better person.
Right.
And so if we take away this understanding, and we're fighting against these doctrines, we don't just lose the restoration, we don't just lose the church, we lose who we are as a people. And I think that then who are we? We cut ourselves off, and then we start living for ourselves, and right, and
We,
you lose faith, you lose hope.
we don't, yeah, we don't have anything that anchors us to who we really are. Let me ask you this real quick. Why do you think it is that we've gotten to this stage? And I'm not talking just the LDS church. I think this is a problem across Mormonism. Why is it you feel like this has been lost on a lot of us? How has it been lost on us?
I just, that's a good question. It just comes down to, I think, we don't study our history.
Right.
We don't study the doctrines, right? We're happy to read verses that make us feel comfortable, and then we listen to podcasts, and that, not knocking podcasts, but where are people going to get their gospel knowledge? They, instead of sitting down and reading the scriptures for what they are, they go and listen to what other people have interpreted for them, right? And then it's, oh, I call it good. This gospel scholar told me that, that, and you can glean really good insight from people who have studied the scriptures. But if we fail to obtain this knowledge for ourselves, you're going to lose it. It's like the parable of the 10 virgins, right? You can't give somebody your light. They actually have to go in the scriptures, and they have to obtain it for themselves, and they have to want it.
Right.
So there is the story of Lucy Walker, where when she was first introduced the practice of plural marriage by Joseph Smith, because she's one of Joseph Smith's wives, she went and prayed, and she tells the story of how she didn't have a sincere desire to know. She agreed to pray, but she didn't really want to know, or she didn't really want the answer. And so she said that she sat in darkness and was depressed, and until she decided, okay, I'm going to pray with a sincere heart and with a desire to know. And once she decided, I'm going to pray sincerely, then she received her answer. And then she talks about how she was flooded with all of this light and understanding. Right? So God doesn't ever give any man a revelation or an answer to a revelation without reasons for understanding it. So if we're going to the Lord in prayer, saying, okay, is this true, God? But your attitude is, I don't really want to know, and I want you to tell me that it's wrong, you're not going to get an answer. And in fact, you might get an answer from the wrong source, that will confirm to you, what you want to hear versus, right, the truth, because God isn't going to reveal to something to you that you don't really want to know. Right. So we really have to learn how to receive an answer, and we have to realize that truth, you actually have to seek truth with a sincere heart, with a desire to know, like it says in the Book of Mormon. It isn't just about going and praying, is this true? It's you have to have the sincere desire. And I honestly don't think people have a sincere desire to actually know that these things are true. I think they don't want to believe they're true, and so they get the answer they desire.
I think you're right. I think you hit on something else that was important too here, Kimberly, which is you talked about, people just go to verses that make them feel good. And I'm not knocking that. Certainly we should be able to go to the scriptures and get comfort there, right? We should expect that. However, this idea that if it's true, we shouldn't have to struggle with it is kind of a bad idea. I just think about what you did. You said you kind of struggled with this, right? And so you went and you dug in, you found it. I think we tend to shy away from those things that challenge us a little bit. I think we all enjoy hearing about Jacob wrestling with an angel, but I think too many of us are content to never do that ourselves, to never go and wrestle with these things that we perceive as hard. And I say perceive because I think once true understanding comes, I don't think it's as hard as what we think it is. It's just foreign at this time. And so I think in some ways, I think we've been a victim of our own affluence in a lot of ways, both physically and spiritually. We've gotten too comfortable, and I think we shy away from the struggle. And unfortunately, it's out of that struggle that I shouldn't say unfortunately, but it's out of that struggle that we gain some of our deepest understandings and our most treasured bits of knowledge when it comes to the gospel.
Yeah, exactly. And too, I think part of, that promise of Elijah of the turning the hearts of the children of the fathers, what was an important part of my journey is then actually going to the words of the men and women themselves, because what we have going on here is we have so many people that are hijacking the stories of the women and then applying their own interpretation, right?
Yep.
So like, I'm just going to give an example and I'll call it out for what it is. Michelle Stone did an entire podcast on trying to label the women, the plural wives of, Joseph Smith and other plural wives in Utah, as trauma bonded victims. So here what she's done is she's hijacked their stories, and she's saying, well, yeah, we have their testimonies, but you can't really trust their testimonies because they were trauma bonded, because they are victims of this rhetoric that was coming from their husbands right? And we have Brigham Young preaching hell and brimstone, and so they were too afraid, and so they just went along. And so she's painted this story, right? She's hijacking their stories, and I didn't listen to what other people were saying. What I did is I actually went and I read the journals. I read what the women said. The women didn't hide that it was a struggle. Right? The sacrifice brings forth the blessings of heaven. They were saying this was a trial, but I did it for my posterity. I did it because the Lord revealed to me that this was true, and he showed me the reasons why I was doing it. And so I was willing to make that sacrifice. And so when times got hard, which they did, and then I remembered the promises of the Lord, and I got through. And when you read their stories, it strengthens your faith, and you're like, well, if they can do hard things, I can do hard things, right? Like, these women were amazing women, and I want to give hope to the sisters, to other women like me, because it wasn't just the men that were receiving these promises. Like, I just want to go into Sister Whitney, who was the wife of Noel K. Whitney. The Lord tells him he's the direct descendant of Melchizedek. Well, you have Sister Whitney, who in her patriarchal blessing, kind of bring it around here, the Lord says to Sister Whitney, he says, I lay my hands upon thy head in the name of the Lord Jesus and confirm the blessings of heaven upon thee in common with thy husband, even all blessings which may be for thy comfort, both of a spiritual and temporal nature. For thou art bone of his bone and flesh of his flesh, and the Lord has so ordained that those of thy same family and descent might be one to fulfill his purposes. For thou art the same lineage of thy husband. Thy life has been hid also, and thou mayest rejoice, for thy posterity shall be blessed. So what did the Lord just reveal to Sarah? She is the exact same lineage as her husband. She's from Melchizedek. Her life has been hid. She's going to receive the same blessings. Her posterity is going to be blessed because she's willing to enter into this covenant, and she's willing to have seed in this covenant, and all of those blessings and that lineage is going to be passed on through her posterity.
Yeah.
So it's not just the men, it's the women. They are just as great as the men. They are of the same lineage, right? They have even greater blessings that are promised to them. And these women knew it. So they're acting on full agency and full knowledge. And it was like, if I can tell another quick story really quick.
No,
so
you're good.
I just loved the women. Like, again, women, we need heroines, right? We need what the world has offered doesn't offer us any heroines. We need righteous women to look to know how to be a woman of covenant, to know how to be a holy woman. And so when we paint these women as these trauma bonded victims, we don't want to go to the women. We don't want to, right? We don't think we can learn anything from them, but we can actually learn so much from them. So Helen Mar Kimball's another example, and she's the 14-year-old that was sealed to Joseph Smith, right?
Right.
Are you familiar with her story? So
not with her story. No, I do know she's a prominent player. Oh, sorry.
Right. She's a prominent player because she's the daughter of Heber C. Kimball. But again, right, secularism and progressives have hijacked her story, and they just paint her as the 14-year-old, bride of Joseph Smith, and then they try to put the label pet on Joseph Smith. And then when you get to know Helen Mar Kimball, she's actually an amazing woman, and she's sealed to Joseph Smith at 14. The marriage is never consummated. She then goes on to marry Horace Whitney as a husband, for time. When she's married to Horace Whitney, she actually stands as proxy for another woman who had died and is sealed, and then she acts as proxy as Horace is sealed to this woman for eternity. And in winter quarters, she has a baby, and which winter quarters is pretty rough, right?
Yeah.
And she has a baby, and instead of giving away, and then she has a baby, and it dies right after birth. And instead of giving into despair, she writes a letter to Horace Whitney, and she said that it was better for the baby to die so that their hearts could be fixed on eternity and on God instead of on themselves.
Right.
And you're like, who has that kind of perspective? Right? Because we're all about self, right? We're all about instant gratification and self, but here are these women that their vision is on eternity, right? And
absolutely.
So I love reading these women because they inspire me, they strengthen my faith. They're not just strong women. These are women that enjoy all of the gifts of the Spirit, the kind of gifts that we only dream of, like, right, the gift of healing, the speaking in tongues. And the Lord really blessed these women.
Nothing bugs me worse than when we paint these women as victims. it infuriates me because we're not giving them their due. In a world that is uber progressive, right, that seeks for total equality, they deny these women that right. In our modern standards, we don't, in society, they like to paint them as beaten down and as subjugated, as second-class citizens within the gospel kingdom. And nothing could be farther from the truth. Were there bad polygamous marriages? Yeah, there was. And you know what? There was bad monogamous marriages. And so this idea that somehow because they were in a plural marriage makes them weak is just absolutely infuriating, especially when we don't take their word for it from their own journals, or we cherry pick just the things out of their journals to support that argument. One of my favorite women from the early Utah period is Martha Hughes Cannon, right? She is the first woman, the first female in the United States elected as a state senator. And who did she beat? She beat her own husband in the election. So not necessarily a woman who's beaten down and kept subjugated by her husband. It's a plural wife who runs against her husband and becomes the first female state senator in the United States, period. And we never hear those stories. We never hear that from the secular, from the other side.
And we never hear the stories of, or the sermons of Brigham Young as actually encouraging the women to go out and become doctors and midwives. Yes. And we never hear of them. He's telling them to become accountants, and he tells them you can be better in business than the men. And it was under the direction of Brigham Young that the Eliza R. Snow and the other women, they built the first hospital, and it was an all-woman hospital board. And then you have
Find me a place in 19th century America where that's happening other than the Utah territory at the time. It doesn't exist.
Right.
It doesn't exist. In quote Victorian society, it doesn't exist. So, yeah.
Yeah. And then you have the women that are leading, the women's rights movement, and of course they're not the women's rights where we think of what the feminists are fighting for. They were leading the women's right movement to, the right to vote, because they were so aligned with the priesthood that they were going to vote righteously, right? And so they're leading that movement. And these are, the women that they're being painted as trauma bonded victims, or like you said, that they are downtrodden and oppressed by their husbands, when they're out accomplishing half of the stuff they've accomplished I've never accomplished in my lifetime, and I never will. And you're like, wow, they did all that, and then we're supposed to look down upon them. Instead, I look to them as they forged the path that I should be on. And you can learn so much from their stories, from their testimonies, and they're teaching principles that you won't hear taught anywhere else, holy principles. Eliza R. Snow, that was kind of her motto. It's the duty of every woman to become a holy woman.
Yep.
And she said, once you gain wisdom, then you have power. And so yeah, I think, like I said, they are the nursing mothers. The women of the Restoration are our nursing mothers, an example that we need to look to, and our hearts need to be turned towards them. And so I see this narrative, it's crafted by the adversary to cut us off from who we are and who we are supposed to become. And it's diabolical, as I can say. It's
it's
truly
very
diabolical.
it's very diabolical. I didn't mean to take you away from your story because I'm super interested in that. You said there was one other account you wanted to read.
Oh, so there's just one more account I want to read, just because, like I said, speaking to the women, right? It's so Eliza R. Snow, she's another plural wife of the prophet Joseph Smith, and we all, she's the Hebrew prophetess, right? And do you know who actually gave her that title as the Hebrew prophetess?
No.
So there is this reporter from the East, and she had heard, rumors of Mormon women and polygamy, and so she wanted to go out and investigate. And I can't remember her last name off the top of my head, but her first name I believe was Emily. And again, so she's like a journalist, a reporter, and she was going to go expose the Mormon women, right? And she gets to Utah, and she is taken to the lion house, Brigham Young's house,
Yep.
and she spends the afternoon with Eliza R. Snow. Instead of writing an expose on Mormon women, she writes an entire article on Eliza, the Hebrew prophetess. And she says when she was introduced to Eliza, she knew she was standing in the presence of a prophetess. And another thing that people don't know about Eliza is that Joseph Smith actually revealed to her that she was from the house of Judah.
Ooh.
So that title, Hebrew prophetess, was especially interesting because she's from the royal house of Judah. And so I want you to think of how then marriage isn't just about a bloodline, but it's about reuniting families and nations. So in Jeremiah, there's a prophecy.
Okay.
And it says, the Lord will bring Judah and Israel together again in the last days, that they will return to the marriage with the kindness, holiness, and love that the bridegroom deserves. Yet return again to me, saith the Lord, for I am married unto you, and I will take you, one of a city and two of a family, and I will bring you to Zion.
Wow.
That's Jeremiah 3. Well, Jeremiah 2, 3, and then I read Jeremiah 3:14. So what is the prophecy? First of all, God is using a metaphor, using marriage.
Right.
The bridegroom is Jesus Christ, and he's married to two brides, Israel and Judah. So right there's a metaphor for plural marriage. But then what is he saying? That with that marriage, he's going to bring together Judah and Israel in the last days. And then they will return to him, and to one of a city and two of a family, and he'll bring them to Zion. So what does the union of Joseph Smith and Eliza R. Snow, who is the royal house of Judah, right? And Joseph Smith is essentially, well, he's Ephraim and Judah, but he's representing the house of Israel. That plural marriage is a literal fulfillment of prophecy.
Holy cow.
He's bringing together again the nation of Judah through a bloodline, right? Again, bloodline.
Right.
The Judah and Israel, and he's making them one again, one family that will establish Zion. It's beautiful. Our history, our doctrine is beautiful. It's inspired. It's
something we should
divine.
be able to stand on, right? It's something that should be able to buoy us up. And like you were saying, though, we just don't know it. And that's a sad thing.
And it should make us proud. And not proud in a negative sense, but just proud of who we are. And then we should want to defend our heritage.
Absolutely.
And more people should be out there defending who they are and defending the prophets of the restoration, instead of letting these core whores in these movements to try to take it away from us and to tear it down.
Yeah. And I felt this for a while. Right now, a lot of the problems the LDS Church face are the same problems that Mormons of every stripe face. And that's why I value your work so much, because we've got to stop the hemorrhaging of our youth. And this is one way we could do it. If we don't give our youth something to fight for, something to stand on, the world will do it for us. And it won't be anything that leads them to righteousness or goodness or anything worthy of God. So.
Right, exactly. Right. Yeah. And I think that we underestimate the youth. Right.
Oh,
We think we need to entertain them and give them like food, fun, and fantasy when they want true doctrine. They
yep.
want, true facts, true history. Let's give them truth,
Yep.
because right, truth is what strengthens faith. It strengthens testimony. If we give them that and we're not making apologies, like stop apologizing for your history, right? Stop apologizing that Joseph Smith was a polygamist.
Yeah.
Stop apologizing for it, and and teach what is true. And I think we underestimate the youth, that if we just give them truth. So I
They'll
think
do.
that's how we save the youth, just giving them the true faith. Because again, what does it say? They were preserved to come through these pure lineages because they are the noble spirits that God has kept in reserve.
Yep.
So you give them truth and they'll live up to who they are and the heritage that they're a part of. And I believe that that is the answer.
I think you're 100% right. I think you're right on the money. Let's stop worrying about entertaining them. I think that's a great thing you said there. I know certainly it seems like too often we spend our time trying to figure out how to engage the youth. And by doing so, we just dumb it down for them, right? Our kids are capable of amazing, amazing things. We just have to first be willing to show them where to go find truth, and then also expect something out of them, right? I think if we do that, they'll walk up to everything we expect out of them. And when I know with my kids, when I've helped them set goals, they've by and large achieved it. And when they haven't, it's usually on me because I didn't do a real good job in outlining it. And so, yeah, we sell our kids short way too much. I agree with you 100%. So I know we've been at this almost 3 hours, but I got one more question for you, and then I'm going to leave you alone. I promise. What's going on with Justin Griffin's second movie? When did that come out? You said January 19th. Is that correct?
So it was released January 19th. So the pretty much this second movie, it sounds like it's a setup for part 3, which at the end of the part 2, he sets up with the Joseph fought polygamy, and Brigham
Okay.
Young started polygamy. So it was pretty much just a precursor to I think part 3 will be the big one, so in part 2, he admits that his theory isn't provable. Essentially, his theory about, he can't prove it happened the way he said it did, that John Taylor and Willie Richards killed Joseph Smith. But his theory is that it at least proves that the church's narrative is all false. And then it's a big setup for part 3, which would be, well, this is why John Taylor and Willie Richards killed Joseph Smith, is because, right, then Brigham Young was trying to take over the church for power and polygamy. And it's a big setup for part 3. So part 2 is actually, I think, not in Justin's favor. It didn't make him look very good. But it is, I think it's, like I said, just a precursor to the part 3, which is again going to probably be an explosive attack against Brigham Young.
Any word on when that
and plural marriage?
Any word on when that's supposed to come out?
I didn't, he didn't say. So
Because
I'm assuming within this year.
my first thought on that is to get together a bunch of my fundamentalist friends who are really well schooled in all this and just go rent out a movie theater and we can laugh. But yeah. What one other question? I am so sorry. I keep saying one more question and I'm gonna let you go. We've talked about how to save our youth. Have you had any success in bringing people back to the truth once they've left for this abomination?
Once they've actually left for the doctrine of Christ,
Yeah.
is that what you're saying?
Yep. That's what I'm saying. Have we had any success in bringing them back after they've left for it?
I haven't actually yet seen anybody come out of it, but
Damn.
because I think it takes, God has to be the one that does it, right?
Right. Yep.
We stand up for truth, and we defend our faith, we defend our religion, we try to, right, we give people a place where they can look for the truth and find it. But ultimately, I think it's God who has to do it.
Okay.
Once you're entrenched in it, and you start fighting, you're fighting against truth, you lose light
Right.
and knowledge, according
Right.
to Doctrine and Covenants 93, right? So like I said, we try to provide the light, we try to bear testimony of truth so they can find it, but ultimately it has to be God that does it.
Gotcha.
And we have to be patient, because I don't give up on anybody, and I don't give up on hope. And I try to tell, people who've had family members or friends that have gotten entrenched into that movement and are fighting against, the church, or fighting against their faith and fighting their family. I just try to tell those families not to give up hope on their loved one or their friend, because I do believe that God, he cares more about them than
Right.
we do. So, and I think our covenant fathers care more about them than we do, because they are their posterity.
Yeah.
Right.
Absolutely.
So,
Absolutely.
and I believe in miracles. So I think we just keep defending the faith, and God can move the mountains.
Perfect. Perfect. Anything that maybe my audience could help out with there? Anything that we can do to help support you and your efforts, or, the Joseph Smith Foundation, or anything like that?
I think the most important thing is for people to learn the history so they can defend it, right? And it's just about knowing the history and knowing the scriptures, and then just be willing to engage in the debate or the discussion. Because if you have, so that's what's successful about the Doctrine of Christ movement, is because you have the leaders, but then you have all of the people that follow them, that then go out and right, are now defending,
Kind of evangelize for that.
Right. And so what we have to do is we have to actually be willing to engage in the argument in the day. And that doesn't mean contention. That just means you're willing to engage in the conversation. You're willing to stand up for what you know is true. You're willing to actually teach the principle, because we're not going to win. We may not win the person we're talking to, but the person watching the debate, you can influence.
Right. Absolutely.
That makes sense. And I just think it's just about getting involved and knowing your history so that you can defend it.
Awesome. All right. Is there anything else you wanted to touch on before we leave?
I think I've said enough for tonight.
Well, perfect. All right. Well, as always, you're welcome back on here anytime. You just got to reach out. I always got a spot for you. I'll make time, whatever it takes.
Oh, I appreciate it.
So
thank you.
Awesome. All right. Stick around for just 5 minutes here, Kimberly. So bye, everybody.
You're listening to the Mormon Renegade Podcast.